वक्रतुंड महाकाय सूर्यकोटि समप्रभ निर्विघ्नं कुरु मे देव सर्वकार्येषु सर्वदा. हरि ओम.
Great.
Namaste, everybody. My name is Pushpita Prasad, and I am here with the Coalition of Hindus of North America. We are very pleased to be here today in what promises to be a very interesting debate about a very newly published book, hot off the presses. And it's my privilege to be here today with the authors of the book, Professor Kundan Singh and Krishna Maheshwari ji. I will actually ask them to do a quick introduction about themselves. Also, my co-partner in crime and the founder of CoHNA, Nikunj Trivedi, who goes back a long way in the Hindu activism space. For those of you who don't know, CoHNA is the Coalition of Hindus of North America. We are an advocacy and education group focused on US and Canada. Our goal is to ensure that Hindus living in these countries have adequate representation and they speak with their own voices and we tell our own stories, whether it's in the lawmaking stage or education. Which brings us again back to the book and the authors we are talking to today. They have done some phenomenal work helping to analyze and correct the textbooks and the textbook battle that waged in California about a decade ago. Their book derives from some of that, and they bring their academic expertise and analysis to some of the issues that were discussed back then, and with the knowledge of, with the benefit of retrospective knowledge and analysis in the years that has followed, and how some of the things that we had feared back then have since come to pass. So without further ado, I will ask Krishna ji and Professor Singh to introduce themselves. Thank you.
Sure. So my name is Krishna Maheshwari. I'm the founder of Hindupedia. We've been in the space with different words, but these days we say decolonizing Hindu studies, focused again on North America, but open to helping globally. And we partnered with Kundanji in 2018, and to deliver the work that we're going to talk about today.
Thank you, Krishna. My name is Kundan Singh. I teach at Sophia University. I did my PhD from the California Institute of Integral Studies in Interdisciplinary Humanities. My dissertation was on Sri Aurobindo, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Ramakrishna. Earlier, I did my bachelor's and master's from Delhi universities. From Delhi University, my master's is in applied psychology and my bachelor's is in chemistry. So that is my brief background. And yes, Krishna and I, we started partnering in 2018, but we met by chance in 2016 in Sacramento when we both were fighting the textbook battle, with our respective energies. So that's a brief story, but I think we will talk more about our relationship, which is extremely important, this partnership that has happened, because this has actually allowed us to pursue the work that we have been pursuing and the details of not just one book, but two books. So yes, that's from me.
Awesome.
Yeah, Nikunji, please.
No, great. I think what I would like Krishna to do is maybe set the context and maybe share your slides so that people can start to understand kind of what is this book about, what is the context that we're talking here, and then we'll go more into the discussion.
Perfect. So just a few short slides to kick us off. Yep. So we know that there is Hindu phobia in classrooms and popular media and news everywhere. And what most people don't recognize is the basis of that sits in academia. And it's not just a limited footprint in academia. At this point, there are approximately 2,000 professors that we're aware of that support anti-Hindu efforts. Now, the presentation of Hindu Dharma, wherever it's done, is not considered racist by those that make it, because they don't consider themselves experts. They're basing it on expert reviews and expert perspectives. And those expert perspectives come from some subset of the 2,000. And now when we talk about the space in academia and why Hindus struggle to step up and to correct the narrative, whenever they do, it ends up being a career limiting move. And so they choose not to do it, or they focus on very obscure topics that no one can actually comment and fight against. And so the core topics remain untouched. And those core topics are the ones that directly impact the narrative. Now, when we talk about textbooks, these are the type of images that we had in textbooks. They're largely removed at this point. But we bring this up because this is the narrative that stays, just without the picture. So it's a little bit harder to talk about at this point. But fundamentally, what it is Hinduism is a recent invention. It's based on a ragtag collection of many religions, some of which are ancient. And at its core, you have this equation of caste, of hierarchy, and oppression. And fundamentally, all of us Hindus bear racism and discrimination against a majority of our fellow brethren Hindus. And so somehow we end up being the oppressors instead of the oppressed. And the ones that create this narrative that where we can't do anything that's positive in this world. And this is what's taught. Even today, despite all the victories and all the efforts, this is still largely what's taught. Now, the two books we'll talk about, the first one is actually the one that came out recently, Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children. What it does is prove that the current narrative has the same implications on children as racism does, which is pretty harmful, and everyone understands what racism does to kids. The second book, which actually came out first, proves why the content is wrong in the narrative and how to revise it. Interestingly enough, the first book, its academic basis came in the second. And the reason I say that is when we authored Making Children Hinduphobic, what we learned and what we somewhat recognized ourselves is there's multiple camps in academia. And we're the smaller camp, right? And against the 2,000 plus others. And so it became a case of my facts versus your facts. And a neutral third party couldn't distinguish between the two. And so then it came to who has more political leverage and more political weight. The new book, Colonial Discourse, changes that game. What it proves is the current narrative is based on fiction. And it's based on projection of some other society's values as if they were Hindu. And so now when you take a look at Making Children Hinduphobic with this backdrop, well, the other facts are fictional. So therefore, there are only one set of facts that remain, and those are the ones that are presented here. So that's how they link, and that's why we talk about both of them together. So that's it, just to kick us off and get us on the same page.
No, wonderful. I think this is the book is the fact that you've kept it open source is really good because it's going to allow people to kind of download it, review it, because it's a large book that has a lot of different layers in it and has a lot of different types of it's an academically sound book, right? So it takes a while to go through it, look at it, analyze it, and then talk about it. But as people start to look at it, right, it's going to be very, very interesting to see the impact that it has on not just students, but also like how the entire discourse is set, right? We're all concerned about students, obviously. That's really the real impact. And that's what we should be, really focusing on, saying, okay, look, this is what's happening. So as you said, Making Children Hinduphobic, this is actually having a more deeper psychological impact on these kids. But so before we start, as we start, first question I have is, what is Francophone analysis? Because it's a nice word, and so I want people to understand what that really means.
I'll answer that question. We have this field in academia, post-colonial studies, right? And in this particular field, we have two kinds of thinkers who are big names. And they can be categorized in two camps: Francophone post-colonial thinkers and Anglophone post-colonial thinkers. So Francophone post-colonial thinkers are those thinkers who wrote their literature in French. And they were basically talking about, the uh, the consequences of French colonization, but they did not realize that their books were going to have a universal appeal. So that's how it happened. Later, of course, these books got translated into English, and we are using the English translation, but they were originally written in French, and that is why we have used this as a subtitle, Francophone post-colonial thinkers, because our container of analysis actually comes from the writers who wrote in French at the beginning.
So that's the framework you're using basically in terms of like, how do you look at the current study and the impact of it, of the current discourse per se. So using that Francophone, so people who have written about this, the sort of the colonizer and the colonized framework, and the impact of that, and through the French sort of Northern African experience, and so the authors that some of them you're talking about are from that kind of area, I guess, and they've talked about the impact of the French colonization on their people, and the people who were colonized at that time. So if I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's kind of where you're going with this, right?
Yes. So let me shed some more light on this. So we have three protagonists in this particular field: Jaime Césaire, Frantz Fanon, and Albert Memmi. Frantz Fanon was born in the Martinique Islands. He was educated in France. He worked in Algeria for a little bit before he joined FLN, and then he was in Northern Africa for some time. Memmi is a Tunisian Jew who spent his teaching career in France later. And Jaime Césaire, who in a certain sense was the teacher of Frantz Fanon, basically went back to Martinique. And that's where, after having an initial career in teaching, he became a politician. And he was the head of the Martinique Islands, much later. Yeah. So that's what the background is.
Okay. So why is their work important? What are some of the things that they have uncovered from their work?
So the reason why their work is important is because they're talking about, the colonized dialectic. And what they are saying essentially is, and this is a theme which runs across all these thinkers, is that the colonizers, in order to show themselves as civilized, went to great lengths to show the colonized as savage and barbarians. So this is their basic framework. And what they were saying is that this particular tendency was followed everywhere that the colonizers went. And within this framework, our next protagonist of the work, James Mill, fits in very nicely, because when you go through the 7 chapters that James Mill has written on the Hindus in volume 1 of the History of British India, you will find that he has represented the Hindus as savage, uncivilized, rude, uncouth, and so on and so forth, in so many different ways. The entire narrative is basically littered with these words. So in a certain sense, you can say that the central thesis of these post-colonial thinkers is getting beautifully validated, by the writings of James Mill. And James Mill's History of British India has had a lasting impact on the discourse on India and Hinduism, and that's what the book talks about.
Yeah, and the Indian the army, like the British officers was a required reading. I think some of this work was like a required reading for some of these officers coming from the UK or Britain to India to understand sort of India and stuff like that. There's a couple of books that I have written. There's a book by Ronald Inden called Imagining India, where he talks about this kind of an idea, right? And even Casts of Mind by Nicholas Dirks talks about that too, that some of these books were required reading for the British officers. So I can see that happening. But I coming back to today's perspective, right? So James Mill, and we'll talk about James Mill. I want, if you can potentially talk about what James Mill is and why it was important. I think that's also because he's one of the main protagonists in this book. So, but before that, I think what I want to ask is kind of coming back to Krishna on, think about what's happened in the California, 2005, 2015, etc. I find that this analysis can be applied to these 2,000 professors that you're talking about, the current discourse, and that's what the focus, should be really. That okay, James Mill was there, lasting impact of it, but even today, when I look at the depiction, right, whether you talk about, oh, look at these Hindu extremists doing all these bad things to minorities, the caste, cow curry, chaos framework that is seeing in textbooks. I think your analysis of what you see from James Mill can be applied today. So maybe, do you want to shed some light on that?
Yeah, so the narrative itself carries forth everywhere, right? You can connect the dots in many different dimensions, and this is certainly one of them. Kind of in this book, we do actually discuss California and the framework that California has that is legislated, that books cover. It's a 5-point framework that was passed, and California is not alone. I think there are 19 states that have similar frameworks in the U.S. And those states are required then to go have books that cover them. Now, California goes a step further in terms of defining a document that then everyone uses to author their books. And then you see that material again in the books at the other end. Now, how this work applies and how this analysis applies, I need to take you back a little bit to the last round in the State Board of Education in 2018. All of the work that we did then, and we cover this in Making Children Hindu-phobic as well, what we said is it violates certain points of the Constitution of California. Right? And the California Constitution requires instructional materials to not violate children's beliefs and not make them insecure in their traditions, and not fundamentally psychologically harm children. And so we called that out of look at these materials in Making Children Hindu-phobic and said it's violating these parts of the California Constitution in this way. And there are 7 or 8 clauses where we called out. The challenge, though, was it was us calling it out without any proof. And where this book applies is now there's proof, right? This is a book that was reviewed through a blind review process with other academics before it's published. So now the experts are agreeing and are saying that this impact exists. Now, when you go back to the state board and say, hey, this impact exists, and it's not us saying it as activists, but the academic opinion states it, it's a very different argument. And so that's how it applies.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, and we also wrote Making Children Hindu-phobic just to raise awareness amongst the parents of Indian American children. Because at that point in time, see, the nature of contestation was very different. When the Hindu side was contesting this narrative, it was trying to contest this on the basis of evidence, saying that this is what is in the textbooks, this is what is there in the framework. It is something very different coming from the tradition when we take an insider's perspective. What was not being done and stated at that point in time was that this discourse is completely Orientalist and racist in nature. So our first step at that point in time was to basically raise the awareness, even as we were pointing out that this narrative that is there in the textbook basically runs on that equation that Krishna talked about earlier, which is Hinduism equals a caste equals hierarchy equals oppression. And in fact, I had written a letter to the State Board of Education, which is, in the appendix of this book, where I talk about how the 85% of that discourse is surrounding this equation, and I also point out how they were basically violating the education codes, and that the State Board of Education needed to take cognizance of those violations and correct the course. So that was, the first step. But the second one was, as Krishna pointed out, we needed to academically prove it, and that's what we did in the second in uh, in the second book. I was always aware of how the facts were, but they needed to come out in the public domain, or rather, I should put it this way. Instead of putting it in the public domain, it is more about putting it in the academic domain, because it's the academics who are involved in the writing of these textbooks, and it is important that the academics realize how orientalist and racist, they are when they sort of regurgitate a discourse which was put in place in the early 19th century. The only difference, if you really look at the discourse today, is that it has become politically correct and sanitized. And this is what we show absolutely clearly within the book. And going back to what you pointed out, Nikunj, earlier, this book also, in a certain way, is a refinement of imagining India of Ronald Reagan, because it sort of takes the framework in which he did his analysis even further. Because over a period of time, I have developed my own theorems on binaries and have included them in developing what is now known as Indian post-colonial theory. And I have applied Indian post-colonial theory, on this narrative. So in a certain sense, I take the discourse of Ronald
Even further.
even further.
Okay.
One thing I'd like to add here is this book was 4 years in the making.
Yeah, I saw 20 exactly.
And the reason is twofold. One, the depth of research needed to be done. That's reflected in the outcome. But the other is certain things needed to be set in academia first. Because if you throw everything in one book, it's impossible to get it through the system. It's too much. And so there's a number of papers that Professor Kundan published, right, through many different academic journals. And the penultimate one was the post-colonial theory, right, the Indian post-colonial theory. Because then this book can rely on those things having already been accepted in academia, versus trying to throw everything at once and opening ourselves up to be contested on everything at the same time.
And at this point in time, I want to say a word of appreciation for Krishna. When we're doing this research, there was a completely uncharted domain into which I entered. And I would say that, that if I did not have the support of my co-author, doing that research would not have been possible. Because I did not know, when I was going to come out of this research. In order to write this book, you would not believe it, I have gone through almost everything which has been written by James Mill, who's voluminous, and what has been written on James Mill, because James Mill in his own days was a very important figure. So, I want to say this, and I want this word to go out within the Hindu community, that in order for good work to come out, it is extremely important that foundations, give the kind of support which is required to professors and authors in order to come out with a book, which can really make a change. And for that, Krishna deserves all my appreciation and my gratitude.
No, that's really important. Yeah, no, I agree with you. And Pushpita, you go ahead. You had a question.
No, actually, it's kind of fitting where Professor was talking about, because my question was about James Mill, right? And so the first, I think it's important that you bring him up, because when you start reading the book, right, you can be like, okay, I understand why it's important to analyze, and see what's happening to kids today. Everyone can see a connection with that. But why James Mill? And, why are we looking at, a figure from 18th century? But I think your first chapter does a really good job of starting to lay out. And I think I was particularly struck at one point. I should have noted down the page number, but you sort of do a one-on-one where you talk about the 2 or 3 salient ways that James Mill thought about Hindus and Brahmins back in the 17th century, and how that's almost like mapping over to the textbooks that you were analyzing in California. So I think that is really powerful for people to understand, because that shows that sometimes obscure 18th century figures are exercising oversized control over our lives today. So I thought, and I think and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but when I read your description of how James Mill did this he became sort of the de facto teacher about Hinduism to colonial British people without having been to India. And I was struck with the parallel with like a modern day figure like, Elizabeth Wilkerson, who's sort of become the de facto expert on caste, but has spent like less than, a month in India, and but is seen as the prince. So I think some of those threads of how we rely on certain figures, I don't know what you think of that particular factor.
Yeah, so on that account, let me give you the basic framework of the work, and we have spoken about this in the preface itself. This work has to be conceptualized as different concentric circles. So the largest concentric circle, which is enveloping all others, is basically the framework of post-colonialism. Within that, we have the Francophone post-colonial thinkers. We spoke about them, right? Now, within that, or rather within those, you have the writings of James Mill. And why the writings of James Mill become important is not only because, he wrote the first history book on India. He became a very powerful figure in the East India Company as well. But that's not about it. I mean, that's not all that is to James Mill. James Mill was a very important figure in British domestic politics as well. And that is something that needs to be understood. James Mill was trained at University of Edinburgh to become a preacher. He did his master's in divinity studies from there. So he tried his hand at becoming a preacher, but he was unsuccessful. That is from 1797 to 1802. In 1802, he came to London to try his hand in journalism. And he became a journalist. Now, in 1806, he stumbled upon the idea of writing the history of British India. And he worked on this work for about 12 years. It was published in late 1817, early 1818. That's when this work got published. In 1808, this gentleman came in contact with Bentham, and people who are familiar with Western history and the rise of Western political thought would know how important a figure Bentham is, because Bentham is considered the father of utilitarianism. The school of utilitarianism has given birth to two major schools of thought: liberalism and Marxism. I won't go into all the details over here. So in 1808, James Mill comes in contact with Bentham. And definitely, between 1808 and 1820, their relationship was very, very tight. So what James Mill did was that he sort of simplified the ideas of Bentham and brought them to the masses. And along with some other disciples of Bentham, they brought about significant changes in the British society, including the reforms, or rather the parliamentary reforms of 1832. The reforms of 1832 are very, very significant. And James Mill is one of the key figures who brought about this reform. So what happened was that in this period, James Mill wrote voluminously on British political and social issues. Now, the interesting thing is that when you will compare his writings on India Hindus and Hinduism in the history of British India, with his social and political writings for Britain, you will see that he has projected and he has imagined. So I would say that, when Ronald Reagan talks about imagining India, he does not have a full clue as to how,
Yeah,
or what the extent of imagination here is.
of course.
Because this imagination is complete projection. Like, let's say, for instance, when James Mill is talking about Hindu Brahmins, he's basically talking about English clergy.
Right.
When he's talking about Hindu forms of governance, he's basically talking about the forms of governance that he wanted to expel from the British society. That is what is occurring over here. And what we have done is that we have exposed these correspondences. It is a thorough expose. And that is why, when you will go into chapters 3 and 4, you will see the extent to which James Mill has savagized us and how he has projected his British stuff onto us. And that is why, it's a complete fabrication. There is not even an iota of truth.
It's really interesting that you bring
Yeah.
that out because, people talk about the Hindu phobia, right? As like generally speaking, you use the word Hindu phobic in the textbook, and they say, oh, Hindu phobia is very politicized. It's a right wing construction of identity and blah blah blah. But one of the first references of Hindu phobia happened, in the 19th century, around the same time, And what's interesting is when the York newspaper described Hindu phobia, they were actually talking about this type of a European attitude towards the natives. And so it's like, it's like full circle. It's like, when you talk about James Mill, when you talk about all these different personalities, they were extremely Hindu-phobic and they were totally projecting what they saw in their, existing society to something that's far away, which they have never had any nuances about. They did not know the language. They've never even been to the darn country to even talk about it, right? And today's academics are very similar. But also what's interesting is, some academics do go to India, okay? And, James Mill did not go to India, but others did go to India, right? But the problem was, I think sometimes they also did not understand the nuances of the society. But I feel that they were also looking for problems. So it's like, I want to fit something in the framework that I come from. And I have a thesis and I want to make like my thesis accurate or, prove my thesis. So I'm going to go find, in the bizarre places or the smallest places that you can find in a remote village in India, some bizarre practice, and then say, well, this is the entire how this whole society works. So
Actually,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
it's actually worse than that, Nikund, but I agree with you. Because you take this fabrication, you take James Mill becoming basically the head of the British East India Company and forcing every British officer to learn it.
Yeah.
So now the entire governance of India is driven by a false narrative. Now, when the governance is driven by that, they don't start pushing policies supporting it.
Yep.
So on one hand, something that's alien to society, to Indian society, is being pushed on it from the top. And at the other end, you have people who are looking for victimhood narratives and to prove it, exactly as you're saying, coming in, and the two are meeting. So they don't have to search very hard because it's being created in front of their eyes by their very own government.
Yeah, and there's something more to this. In 1825, James Mill and his cohort put together University of London. So all this writing, which was going on at that point in time, became part of the academic discourse. And we have not done this work, in this particular treatise, but maybe in the future, we will show that the framework which James Mill created in History of British India got reflected in publications that came out from Oxford and Cambridge University Press. So there are many things that were happening simultaneously. So not only History of British India became a required reading at Haileybury College, where the East India Company officials were getting trained, who were going to serve in India. The writings of James Mill also became part of the academic discourse. This is what the genealogy is. And once this discourse was set in motion, once this became part of, various, university presses, it began to have a long-lasting effect. In fact, this discourse is getting reflected in India as well. I have made a presentation at a conference where I'm talking about the reflection of this discourse on NCERT books. It's already in the public domain. So this is, wherever you go, where in whatever part of the world you go, where India and Hinduism is getting discussed at this point in time, you'll find this narrative. It is widely prevalent in India as well. That is the extent of this discourse, or let me put it this way, this is how sinister this discourse actually is. So, in fact, both Krishna and I would like to say is that this is just the beginning of what we are going to unfold in the future. We have just scratched the surface at this point in time.
Yeah.
And as you know, we don't fall in this category of left or right. We are absolutely beyond that. We are beyond this binary. I have written extensively on binaries. I've spoken about how Hindu cosmology essentially goes beyond binaries, whereas Western cosmology is embedded in binaries. So if anyone who says that we belong to the right, or to the left, is basically playing with facts.
Yeah, I mean,
Representing us, yes.
we
Sorry.
certainly see that in our work, and we call it out all the time that the work we do is not left or right, and we certainly get attacks from both sides, and we look to have allies on both sides because this is not an ideological issue. This is a much deeper issue. And you were talking about academic discourse, right? So I want to switch gears a little bit from James Mill to chapter 6, right, where you sort of bring together the threads of James Mill, the francophone people that you're drawing from. And I think one line that jumped out to me, right, which really ties in with what we do, is when you talked about I'm sorry, I'm trying to find the exact spot, but I think you basically talk about colonialism is racism. I mean, you frame it more elegantly, but that's the gist of what you're trying to say. And then I think helping people understand through the work of other academics as well as yours, that the long-term physiological damage caused by this sort of prevailing colonial discourse, which is also racist discourse, as your work shows, and I think you use Tottem's work about the impact racism had on Black kids, and then I think you help us see how that same thing is playing out with Hindu kids today. So if people read nothing else, I will say please read that one chapter because it is so powerful and it is so relevant to what we are dealing with today. You don't even have to be an activist or anything. You just have to be a parent or somebody concerned about what's going on in society today. But talk to us about, when you say the myths masquerading as facts, essentially stated that, how we start to internalize the hate against us, right? Because we believe that the myths masquerading as facts make us believe that we have no culture, language, history, science, etc. So how does that happen, and how obviously some of us see it play out, but just would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So So as we are pointing out, throughout this book, that the narrative revolves around hierarchy and oppression, right? Now, look at what the cultural ethos of the United States are at this point in time. Equality and emancipation, right? Hierarchy and oppression are the radical other of equality and emancipation, right? So these children, right from the very beginning, they become othered. And even when they do not have a language to understand what they're encountering, they begin to feel it. And that is why, they start feeling shame, inferiority complex, and so on and so forth. But before that happens, they begin to get bullied as well. And we have spoken about. So what it does is that, that this discourse just goes and attacks their very psyche. And that is the reason you are finding a lot of Hindu kids or Indian American kids going away from the tradition or disconnecting, from their parents, particularly when they want to talk about the issues of culture, religion, and so on and so forth. So this is basically what is happening. And 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 any discourse which is based on fabrication and imagination is nothing but a racist discourse. We go into the details of discussing that also, how the discourse is racist. But essentially what happens is that this discourse is not only colonialist, but it is also racist, and it would not be too difficult, for scholars of post-colonial studies to realize that a colonial discourse is always a racist discourse because it others. And there are many different ways in which uh, othering happens, So this is one kind of othering that we are talking about. There are other ways in which India also has been othered, but that is for, our future work to unfold.
Okay.
In terms of psychological issues, Krishna, do you want to add a few more things here, please?
Yeah, and we go into it in chapter 6, but I'll highlight a couple of things. We saw it in what we studied. I've seen it many other times growing up here, as well as talking to people in that age group. I've talked to people and we've talked about what's going on in society, and you get a certain apathy, right? The othering means I'm an other to my own people, to my own people who share my beliefs, and I don't care. On the other hand, there are other people that are being othered for whatever reason that children will get deep empathy for, right? So now you're apathetic to your own society and deeply empathetic to another. And sometimes the other society you're empathetic for is actually inimical to your own. And so you see this happen to children. You also see it way too late as a parent. We all do our best as parents. And some of us will take kids to school, to Sunday school, to temple, to Sunday programs. But you can't deal with what's taught in school. And I would say the majority of us, every day of every school day, will say, listen to your kids, listen to your teachers, understand what they're saying, do well in the test. Most of us don't know what's taught when it comes to this one topic area. And even if we did, if we went to our children and said, beta, beti, don't listen to the teacher here, the kids aren't going to listen to us at that point. Our brainwashing has been too effective. And the impact of that, we won't recognize because the kids don't tell us. It's something that gets boiled down into their core and is held close because they know as parents we would be opposed to what they feel. So they don't share. You find out at the other end of college once they're out of the house. And then it comes out and it's like, oh my God, how did that happen? But now it's too late.
Yeah, and we see those examples a lot. One of the reasons why we started the Hindu Parents Network was because we were seeing parents, grappling with this in the middle school time frame when the caste and all this other stuff is introduced, and by the time it comes to college, it's too late, as you said. So kids are already Hindu phobic, or at least at best apathetic, right? There's this huge movement going on of like a lot of Hindu kids saying, well, we're just atheists, right? Because there's nothing good for them to believe, there's nothing positive for them to look at, and divinity is just a fluff, so they don't really, it's not scientific. And by the way, we have caste, right? So all of these things have been added together to create a perfect storm in the mind of a young Hindu kid who now wants to shy away from the culture and internalizes that kind of hatred and says, okay, I don't want to be associated with this thing. However, there's a lot of positive other stuff that is put out there saying, you must stand for this, or you must stand for that, or you must side with this. And so the kids has inherent good values because that's what we have told them. But now all of a sudden they raise the flag for somebody else, and nothing for the Hindu community.
Yeah.
But I think, as their book points out, right? I mean, and scholars have said that self-hatred is one of the major consequences of the racist or colonialist discourse that is being taught in schools that many times we're not aware of. And if we're aware of, we don't know how to tackle it because it's hard as an individual to fight back against city hall or school boards or the education system in this case. So I
Yeah.
think that's actually a
There's,
really powerful way to understand some of the answers, some of the questions that we get is like, what happened to my kid? And, I did my best, etc. Maybe a little late, but I think starts to frame some of those issues. I also just wanted to like see if there was anything you wanted to highlight because you analyzed testimony. You said 72 kids had testified, and I see that you break it up nicely by grade, but like, is there some, and there's all of it is very moving, but is there something that you think has, something that you just, if people could remember one thing, this just to take away from that testimony, and I maybe two things, right? One from a parent perspective and one from a young adult who's maybe just trying to make sense of this school system that they came through, if they actually came through it relatively unscathed, how to think about it.
so just one quick correction. There are more than 72 kids that testified. We focused on 72 that they happened to be on 2 specific days that we reviewed. There's a
Okay.
lot more work to be done in that regard. But with regards to the actual testimonies, when the testimonies happened, the parents testified, and in many cases their children testified, and occasionally the kids testified without their parents testifying. But what was stark was they were speaking from their heart. The parents were reading off of paper, but the kids were speaking from the heart. I can't recall a specific instance where a kid took out a piece of paper and read from it. And they were speaking from their own personal experience or from the experience of their siblings. And the younger ones, they were talking about their elder brothers and sisters. Those were even worse because those kids hadn't experienced this, but they were afraid of experiencing it because they saw what happened to their brothers and sisters. So that's what is the deepest takeaway that I took from watching those live and then in reviewing all of the testimonies afterwards as well.
In fact, there's one testimony on that account, Krishna, that's, that I want to read out. This is from page 20, from 225 of the book. I am a 5th grader. My older sister is in the 9th grade, and she learned misguided information about Hindu culture. I know many truths about Hinduism, but her classmates don't. I don't want to go through what my sister felt and read about my culture in our school. I also don't want to be teased, taunted, and bullied by my classmate due to what the textbook will say next year. And then there's one, who's actually appealing to the school board to make a change. And these were very, very moving testimonies, So what I would say is that the academics, can focus on rest of the chapters, but the Indian American parents would basically want to begin, from chapters 5 and 6, and then backtrack
Look backwards.
into, the content of the book. So yeah. And see, the thing is that, at this point in time, what you find in university is that social sciences operate on this fundamental dichotomy of oppressed versus the oppressor, right? And the discourse on Hinduism in India in social sciences makes the Hindus as oppressors. So, the kids of other ethnicities, they have the ammunition to fight back racist representation, but the Hindu kids don't. They don't have the ammunition. In fact, they are designated as the oppressors in a complete inversion of truth. And that's why we say that this is not a thing of activism for us. It's a matter of truth. We have shown it absolutely clearly that this is nothing but a complete fabrication. And even this, in my understanding, is an understatement. It's a complete fabrication. It's a complete projection. It is a complete concoction. And we are suffering because of the lies that have become institutionalized within the educational setting. In fact, I want to appeal to the academics of all shades to actually go through this book. Not because we want this book to become popular, but because they will be able to counter this discourse at their own levels in far more ways than we can imagine at this point.
Wonderful. I mean, we can continue to talk about this till we can, for hours and hours. What I would like to do is maybe Krishna, you want to kind of summarize a few things. You had something that you want to kind of close with, so maybe we go with that.
Sure.
And naturally, the book is available online for free. Just to let you know, we're going to be adding this book to our website along with a link to Making Children Hindu-Phobic. We have a page on Hindu phobia that we have developed, and we're gathering all the academic articles, all the academic writings that showcase how Hindu-phobic narrative shapes up. So this is definitely going to be featured in there.
Thank you. Yeah, so let me close with where we began, and then with an appeal. So we began with a question on what does francophone mean, and why did we choose them? Right? Kundanji talked about Anglophone versus Francophone, and the Francophones wrote in French, hence the name. But there's one more reason, and it kind of came out through the course of this conversation. And that is the Francophones focused on the psychological impact of colonization, and the others didn't. They focused on other aspects of it. And this work, and the reason both of us are involved so deeply, is very much focused on the psychological consequences on our children collectively. And not just our children, all other children as well. The process of othering is two parts, right? There's the one that's othered, which is our children, and then everyone else who participates in the othering. And that has a mental and psychological impact on them as well. Now, we don't go into that in this work. It's the others, but it is the other side of the coin.
Correct.
And as a community, we have to be aware of it. And it gets a little bit worse because not just as a community we have to be aware of it, but as parents, we've also been colonized to some extent or another. I would say very few of us have not had any impact, because this discourse is so deep that if you've studied anywhere and grown up anywhere, some aspect of that impact has landed on you and is a part of your psychological makeup. And I don't exclude the two of us from that either. That's not black and white, and there is a spectrum, but everyone's on that spectrum somewhere, unless you happen to be born before the 1800s. Now, just to end, Kundanji alluded to a couple of areas of follow-on research. And the reality is that we, in the course of the last 4 years, have identified enough follow-on research that 200 years wouldn't be enough to do it all if we were left alone to do it. So we need to grow, and we need to expand scholarship. And we need to publish. A lot of the work that we do is in the academic domain. This work is open access, but most of the papers that get published are not. As much as knowledge should be free, the reality is knowledge is not free in the academic domain. But it is available to academics. So we don't get a chance to talk about the work a lot, and we certainly don't get a chance to move it around because we'd be violating copyright should we do so and make those papers freely available. But we do need financial support to do it. And this work has taken 4 years of research and another year of full-time effort by Kundanji to see the light of day. I've been involved part-time, but he's done the heavy lifting. And we need more than just Kundanji involved. like I said, there's more work than we could possibly do in our lifetimes. And so we do want to make a financial appeal. And for folks that are watching this to support this work, the big ugly QR code takes you to a donation page. You've got the two different short URLs through two different payment processors as well. But financial donations would certainly be appreciated. So we can continue doing this work and expand upon it in ways that benefit all of us together.
Awesome. Yeah, certainly, this is going to be a very interesting journey. I think this is just the beginning, like I look at it, and there's so much more that you guys will be uncovering, and looking forward to hearing and listening, and also supporting in some ways possible as we go forward in terms of partnerships and giving you guys a platform. Certainly from our end and stuff, we have a lot more work coming up in terms of activities, events that are not necessarily academic in nature, but they do reach out to policymakers. So they should also know that what they're talking about in academics has an impact on what they understand about India and about Hinduism and stuff like that. So they're not immune to it. They're a product of the system. So wonderful. All right. Well, thank you both for this enlightening conversation. And we look forward to working with you guys in this particular publication, but also other things, and how we can support going forward in terms of our partnerships and more forums like this for you. Namaste.
Namaste. We're happy to be here.